Okay, tonight we continue Frankie Fish and the Sonic Suitcase. We are up to chapter 4, The Shed of Secrets. Frankie was breathing heavily, his shoulders bobbing up and down like beach balls lost at sea. He couldn't believe that he was actually inside the totally out of bounds, not even in a zombie apocalypse shed. But where was Grandad? Frankie gulped as he hung nervously near the doorway. "Grandad," he said softly, just in case the old crank was hiding. He knew he should probably get out of there, but this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Like kicking the winning goal at the World Cup or eating ice cream for breakfast. So Frankie decided to take a sneaky peek around. He felt like Neil Armstrong arriving on the moon. One small step for Frankie Fish and one huge leap for fish kind. What did you want to ask? Nothing? Okay. Inside, the shed was dark and dusty. Frankie crept in stealthily, like he was attempting to steal jewels from around the Queen's neck while she slept. The dusty floorboards creaked under his feet, and with every sound his heart raced a little faster. In the centre of the shed, he stopped and waited impatiently as his eyes adjusted to the gloom. Finally, he would get to see what his grandfather kept hidden in there. Spare parts from dishwashers and car engines adorned the benches, alongside jars brimming with rusty screws. Frankie sighed. Total bummer. This was the biggest anti-climax since the top deck of the double-decker bus was ruled out of bounds on the double-decker bus excursion because of Miss Merriweather's fear of heights. Taking a deep breath, Frankie sneaked even deeper into the shed. Maybe the good stuff was right at the back. But there were no moon craters or alien life forms to be seen, just wonky shelves lined with dusty trophies, frayed ribbons and faded certificates, as well as some dog-eared black and white photos of a car race. Frankie leaned closer to examine the blown-up photograph of a dashing young driver. He was leaning against a number 42 racing car, looking cheerful and strangely familiar. Squinting, Frankie read the faded lettering in the photo's white border. Alfie Fish, Glasgow, 1952. What the? The blonde bombshell next to the race car was Frankie's own granddad. He looked so different. Fit and healthy, and weirdest of all, happy. A strange feeling burbled inside Frankie Fish. This guy was cool. In another photo, Alfie held up a huge trophy as two smiling women in stiff old-fashioned dresses poured a bottle of champagne over him. Frankie knew that if he tried that, he'd be in big trouble, but in the photo, Alfie was beaming. At the back of yet another shelf was a photo of an older man in a trench coat leaning into young Alfie's race car. The writing on the border said, "Ernest gives me last-minute instructions." Frankie wasn't exactly an expert on the Fish family tree, but he knew his great-grandparents' names were Ernest and Edna. He examined the image closely. Ernest had hands the size of Christmas hams and a smile as wonky as a day-old donkey. Behind the car was another figure, a boy who looked a lot like Alfie, only smaller. Could this be his granddad's mysterious brother, the one no one ever spoke about? Frankie scratched his forehead. Was he called Robbie? Ronnie? No, Roddy. That was it, Roddy. Roddy was staring at Alfie like he thought he was the greatest person ever. But Alfie was paying him no attention. I know how that feels, thought Frankie bitterly. Returning the photo to the shelf, Frankie caught sight of something yellow sticking out of a book. Carefully, he took the book off the shelf. Gravitational Space, The Mechanics of Time Travel, it said on the cover, and removed two delicate pieces of paper. The first was a newspaper clipping headed, "Big Race Ends in Big Tragedy." Frankie read aloud to himself. One thing is certain, the championship of 1952 will be remembered not for reigning champion Clancy Fairplay taking the checkered flag, but for race leader Alfie Fish skidding through an oil mark on the final turn and tragically crashing. Reports are emerging that it has cost him his right hand and maybe even ended his boyhood dream. Right there and then, you could have knocked Frankie down with 3/4 of a feather. Without even meaning to, he'd solved the mystery of the missing hand. Frankie's eyes were drawn back to the image of young Alfie proudly clutching the trophy. Poor Grandad, thought Frankie. The other piece of paper was just an old advertising flyer depicting a man with a pencil-thin moustache and a cape, hand-drawn in black ink. The amazing Fredo, with his fierce stare and dramatic hand gestures, seemed to be summoning words that appeared in puffs of smoke. The artist had drawn electrical bolts flying in and out of the wonky-looking cube. It was the kind of cheesy old thing that Frankie was sure Drew would get a big kick out of. He slipped it in his pocket next to the forgotten forgot-me-not, when, if he ever got to see his friend again, he'd show it to him. The amazing Fredo. A lady sawn in half. Animals appear out of thin air. Plus 6 electric eels and the water tank of death. It was only when Frankie was about to leave the shed that he noticed the ruby-coloured suitcase sitting open on an adjacent bench. Usually, a suitcase on a bench in a shed wouldn't be of much interest, but considering the startling developments of the past few minutes, Frankie sensed that it might not be your regular run-of-the-mill suitcase. Frankie edged closer and peered in. He wasn't sure what he was expecting to see. Spare hand hooks maybe, but he definitely wasn't expecting a computer. Well, a sort of computer. It was a hybrid of an old chunky laptop and a typewriter connected with hundreds of tiny wires and held together with hockey straps. Unbelievable, thought Frankie, as all the sympathy he'd been feeling melted away. He's been secretly using a computer this whole time. Could he be any more selfish? He took a closer look. The computer, if it could be called that, had a small screen set into the lid. The suitcase itself was quite impressive, with a leather handle, a hard case, and tiny monograms that Frankie could only just make out as HT. There was a soft whispering noise behind him, and Frankie whipped around, his heart beating madly, but no one was there. He knew Grandad could come back any minute. If Frankie was going to snoop around, he'd better hurry, and the main thing was to find out if this computer had internet access. Maybe he could get a message to Drew Bird. Frankie went to press enter on the DIY keyboard, but something very strange happened. His finger went straight through the button and hit the wooden bench. It was only now that Frankie noticed the computer appeared to be shimmering slightly in the dusky light. A message popped up on the screen in blinking green letters. The time computer is temporarily inactive as operation remains in progress. Frankie frowned. Sure, he was being tricked somehow. It was bad enough that Grandad was a jerk, but for him to be a jerk who was playing a prank on Frankie, that was too much. Frankie and Drew were the prank kings, and nobody pranked the prank kings. Two can play at this game, old man, thought Frankie. Nana Fish wouldn't like Grandad disappearing around dinner time, not one bit. Carefully closing the shed door behind him, Frankie hurried down the brick path towards the house. He was so keen to dob on Grandad that he failed to notice the pretty flowers that had been growing in Nana's garden were now weeds. If Frankie had been paying more attention, he'd have also noticed grasshoppers the size of soft drink cans hopping around where the forget-me-nots were only minutes earlier. "Nana," Frankie yelled as he burst into the kitchen, "I can't find Grandad. I think he's fled the country." But there was no sign of Nana. Not only that, but the house had completely changed. It was as if Nana had never lived there at all. Now Frankie Fish was paying attention. Chapter 5. The Mysterious Disappearance of Nana Fish. Frankie did a double take. He had walked into Nana Fish's house, hadn't he? Yes, of course he had. The brick path he had danced down was the same, and the back entrance had the same flywire screen door, except now it had a hole in it and was acting as a revolving door for flies and mosquitoes. It was the very same house in which he'd spent the last few days lying around in utter boredom, but it also wasn't. "Nana!" he called, darting from room to room, but Nana was nowhere to be found. There wasn't any trace of her. In the lounge room, Nana's bright polka-dot curtains had been replaced by a wrinkled brown pair that were drawn tightly closed, even though it was still light outside. The scent of home cooking had gone, and a stale funk lingered instead, as if the windows had never been opened. Beneath Frankie's sneakers, Nana's freshly mopped floors were now crusted with a thick layer of old dirt. Frankie started to feel a bit scared. "What's going on?" he said aloud in the dark house. He hurried to the phone. His dad had told him only to call home in an emergency, but surely a missing Nana in a weirdly different house qualified as one. Ring, 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 ring. A bored-sounding man answered. "Hello, this is Max's Fish and Chips. If you need dinner, we've got a..." "Hello, is tuna fish there?" asked Frankie, his voice quivering. "Ha ha, very funny," the unfamiliar man said. "Are you just making a prank call, or do you want some fish and chips?" "Dad?" Frankie said, almost whispering. The man snorted and hung up. Frankie put down the phone, his hands trembling. What was happening? "Mavis! Mavis!" It was Grandad bellowing from outside, and for the first time ever, Frankie was relieved to hear it. The back door swung open, and Grandad's voice became louder and more urgent. "Mavis!" Frankie walked into the grimy kitchen, feeling as though his feet were on backwards. A flustered-looking Grandad was standing there, gaping at the funky smell, the darkness, the ugly curtains, and the very changes that Frankie had gaped at too. A small part of Frankie was relieved that someone else was seeing this too, and he wasn't going crazy. But a much larger part of him wished that the someone else was anyone but his Grandad. "Mavis," Grandad said again, more worried this time. He finally noticed Frankie, and for once he didn't glare. "Have you seen Nana?" "She's not here," Frankie said numbly. "Grandad, what's going on?" But Grandad just stood there, terror written all over his face. "Oh dear Lord," he whispered. Frankie was properly scared now. "Please, Grandad, Nana's gone, and then I tried to call my parents and the phone number is different," and suddenly Frankie remembered the peculiar computer in the suitcase and the message saying operation remains in progress. The hairs on Frankie's neck stood up like the national anthem was being played. "Did you do something to Nana? Did you make her go away?" "How dare you accuse me?" spat Grandad, but he looked guilty. Something shifted inside Frankie. He went from feeling scared to angry. Grandad had obviously done something to Nana, maybe even erased her, and as Miss Merriweather would say, it warranted a rise in tone. "This has something to do with that dumb computer in your shed, doesn't it?" Frankie said, his voice loud and strangely high. "I saw it, Grandad, and I know something weird is going on." "Been snooping in my shed, have you?" roared Grandad. "Not another word from you, boy. Just stop." He snapped and thrust his hand in front of him like a police officer directing traffic, and indeed Frankie did stop, but not because his Grandad had ordered him to. No, Frankie was beyond listening to the old man's orders at this point. It was because the right hand Grandad was holding up was his right hand. Alfie Fisher's right hand, which had been missing for more than 50 years, was back. Frankie went back to being scared again. Where's your hook?" he stuttered. "You need to be quiet and let me think," Grandad said, running his hands through his thinning hair. "Just shut your..." What have you done?" Frankie pleaded. "Why is everything suddenly different? Where is Nana Fish and your hook and my parents?" Alfie Fish was clearly about to unleash another verbal barrage on Frankie when he suddenly stopped himself, lowered his hands and took a step closer to his grandson. In a very different tone he said, "Oh my, your face," and inspected every inch of Frankie's face as if he was trying to spot spinach between his teeth, and up his nose and in his ears. He leaned back to pull open the curtains wider and let the fading evening light spill into the kitchen, and then stared at Frankie again. Your face, he repeated with concern. My face? What about your face? Frankie said defensively. It's old and wrinkly and... Never mind, muttered Grandad to himself. I need to go back. Go where? Asked Frankie. Never mind. Never mind? I do mind, yelled Frankie. You're just a kid, Grandad shot back. You don't know what you're dealing with. At that, Frankie lost it. And you're just a crazy, mean old man who somehow messed up everything and made Nana Fish disappear and turned my family into a fish and chip shop. So wherever it is you're going, old man, I am coming too. He screamed at the top of his lungs. He's a bit cranky, isn't he? There was a very long pause that, if it had gone on any longer, could have asked for its own spot on the calendar. Frankie braced for impact. Grandad grabbed Frankie by the arm, dragged him out of the kitchen, through the back door and down the back garden path. Frankie barely had time to ask, "Where are we going?" before he was back inside the forbidden shed, which appeared to be less and less forbidden by the minute, with the door slammed shut behind him.